Welcome to the latest installment of Harvard Business School's Managing Through Crisis webinar series. I have to say this is a reprisal of sorts because we launched this series almost 2 years ago in March of 2020 when the global pandemic was just getting started and business leaders were scrambling to understand what the implications were for them and for their organizations. And at that time, Harvard Business School faculty were more than willing to share their thoughts on everything from supply chain issues to remote work and, of course, leadership. And today we've asked Professor Nancy Koehn, who was among those folks, to join us again to give her thoughts about what's happened in the last couple of years and what leaders need to think about as this moves into sort of unprecedented territory and we're not sure how long this crisis is going to carry on. Nancy's research focuses on crisis leadership and how leaders and their teams rise to the challenge in high stakes situations. She wrote the book, Forged in Crisis, The Power of Courageous Leadership in Turbulent Times, which spotlights how 5 of history's greatest leaders managed crisis, and in doing this, accomplished extraordinary missions. Nancy, it's always a pleasure to have you on. I love the way that history is still so highly relevant today, and you make it highly relevant in the lessons that you teach and that you talk about. And I'm glad that you're back to share your insights 2 years later with us and what we continue to grapple with as a global society. So thanks for being here.
It's always a pleasure to be with you, Brian, and this series has been so important and so interesting, not only, I hope, for viewers and our alumni and our community, but also for the faculty, right? We've learned a ton in the last 2 years, particularly people like myself or Dutch Leonard, one of the professors at the school, who's also a professor at the Kennedy School. And if you're interested in crisis leadership, it's just been like, in some ways, a kind of terrifying and awe-inspiring smorgasbord. Long table, right, that keeps extending into the future. Let me say one thing just before we launch into what I'm sure are going to be some fantastic questions from you. I wrote the book Forged in Crisis because I was so struck in my research, which I'm a biographer. I study individual leaders and these dramatic experiences, and then say, what do we learn today from it, right? Harvard Business School, we're interested in learning from the past. And one of the things that's really struck me and was the really impetus for Forged in Crisis was that great leaders are really made largely through experience. There's a big nature part to it, but nurture and the experience, particularly crises when sort of all bets are off on stability and you have to do so much improvisation, are these amazing greenhouses for individual leaders to get stronger, more creative, more adaptive, more courageous within themselves, and then help the people around them, who then help the people around them do exactly the same thing. David Foster Wallace, an American writer, once said, real leaders are individuals who help us break through the boundaries of fear and selfishness and laziness and weakness and get us to do harder, better things than we can get ourselves to do on our own. And that's what happens in a crisis. And that cascading effect, for people that are paying attention and self-aware and interested in finding some lemonade in the lemons of turbulence, that opportunity is very, very rich and very real, and it happens most significantly and most lastingly in a crisis. So for all the difficulty and challenge and heartbreak of the pandemic, we are in a new phase and we have new opportunities to get even better and stronger and braver and more resilient.
Yeah, that's really well put. And, one of the things that our Dean Shrikant Tatar has said repeatedly is that he sees COVID as the pathway to the future for Harvard Business School. And so I think that for leaders who want to find it, there is a silver lining here. There's opportunity that can arise in this situation. But for those who are watching who might feel a little beleaguered at this point because it's 2 years later and they're a little worn down and we're all feeling that way a little bit, what would you say to a leader who's listening about, how they should think about this current phase and how they might want to adjust and sort of settle into what seems to be an ongoing thing?
Yeah. Well, let me just first say that anyone that's watching or listening that feels beleaguered, you're not alone. I do a lot of coaching, and I work not only with business leaders, but with healthcare leaders and public safety officials and philanthropists and arts leaders, and everyone I've spoken to in the last, say, 3 months is exhausted, absolutely exhausted. So you're not alone. That then, in a sense, raises an issue of how do we kind of inject more credible or buoyant hope and energy. We can come to that a little bit later if you want. But I think that this phase of the pandemic is about pulling on tools that we know work, developing some new ones, but also being very, very attentive to helping first ourselves and then the people that look to us for guidance, or you look to you for guidance. I'm speaking to leaders. I'm a coach, not a leader. Help them adjust to the time frame. So the first thing I would say, as someone who studies leaders, most of whom are in crises of at least 4 years in duration, from Abraham Lincoln to Frederick Douglass to Rachel Carson, to the civil rights leaders who I'm now studying and trying to learn from. The first thing that these people learn after the initial, well, it'll be quick, right? Everyone assumes it'll be short. Lincoln assumed it. Shackleton, the explorer whose lifeboat you see reconstructed here on my virtual background, thought they'd be out of this fix in a couple of months. It took 2 years, etc. Hitler thought World War II would be over in 4 months, and those trying to topple him, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, thought, well, this isn't going to take so long because we're going to figure out how to do this. The war is going to turn quickly. The first thing that the leader has to understand is, I don't know when it's going to end. So that means, first lesson, resist simplistic answers about the predictability and the duration of the crisis. Resist it. Embrace the idea. Own it. Let it seep into your pores. This is going to take a while. The civil rights leaders, Martin Luther King, John Lewis, they were brilliant at this. Lincoln, Shackleton, they all had to first let go of the idea when it was quickly apparent that this wasn't going to be over and done by Christmas or in 4 months, and say, I'm going to really entertain conjecture, and in fact, embrace the idea that I don't know how long this is going to last. So the first lesson is, you don't know, surrender to that or own that, and then help your followers own that. Martin Luther King was brilliant at this. We will do this, and then we will do this, and we will not, right? We will not give up until we reach the promised land, even if it takes a lifetime, because every step we move forward on that path is moving us closer and accomplishing something important within us and around us. So that kind of, right, again, acceptance, and then the willingness to frame the time with an open-ended, right, if you will, like view to your people, is really important. The second piece, though, of that is you're saying to each person as you do that, second lesson, we are not starting at square one, right? Churchill in 42 was not where he was when he became prime minister, and Dunkirk loomed in the spring of 1940, right? So and that has to be owned by the leader. You're stronger, you know more, you have many more tools, you have made great distance already, owned by the leader, and then, as I keep saying, pass to the followers. So we are not starting from square one. We know what to do, and we've learned a great deal about which tools to pull out in which order. Third, you help people understand that the fact that this is a long-term crisis presents possibilities as it stretches on, right? All kinds of different possibilities within your organization, possibilities for your Shrikant Tatar. COVID is the Harvard Business School's path to the future, right? So opportunities for what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, what we're going to learn, and what our mission, how we will keep advancing our mission under great duress. And the fourth and final thing I would say is you as a leader, and then for your followers, you literally take the mission. Why do we exist, and what are we doing here? You take the mission and you grab it close to your heart, and then you repeat it to your followers at every possible juncture. So we hear a lot about that. Investor relations folks are great at this, but I'm talking about something a little bit different. I'm talking about literally weaving it in to what you're up to day to day and what you're saying, and connecting everything to the fact that despite the storms around us, right, besetting us, threatening to topple the mast, we are on mission. Right? John Lewis once said, freedom is not a state of being. It's a set of actions that you take and that you don't give up taking no matter the obstacles.
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about. It's not so hard to do. Leaders just have to keep reminding themselves to do it. All these things, last comment, empower, not deplete, empower the people that are following you. And that's so important right
Yeah, those are amazing insights. And I think, one of the things is you look at some of the people that you've studied, Shackleton, Churchill, these are leaders who were leading in desperate times in life or death situations. So the people that were listening to them had a lot at stake. And I think, the point of reminding people that this is ours collectively to make happen is critically important. How important is authenticity in the leader in these situations? Because you mentioned early on in our conversation that this can't just be, we're not going to be happy just for the sake of being
now.
positive and trying to energize people. Authenticity gets tested here in situations like this. Are there leaders today that you can point to who you feel like are doing this well and credibly?
Yes, let me just big call out to Jacinda Ardern, the head of New Zealand, who I think from the get-go has been a brilliant crisis leader. She's young, she's serious. She has managed both sides of the pandemic. That is, she's managed the health, the public health and logistical and practical and tool piece of the pandemic for New Zealand, right? Which has, just by virtue of its geography, an easier time of it in the sense that it's an island, but they've had a remarkable COVID kind of track record, and that's due more to Jacinda Ardern and her team than it is to their island status. She's managed both, again, the material critical piece of the pandemic, and equally important, the emotional piece, the credible hope piece, as I like to call it, right? Brutal honesty, credible hope is what crisis leaders are communicating to their people. And she's been, I think, exceptionally authentic. But let me add a critical bracketed piece to what do I mean by exceptionally authentic. Leaders in a crisis, and leaders vary in almost any circumstance, but particularly in a crisis when stakes are as high as they are here, and we're talking about life and death, and we're talking about enormous amounts of fear and uncertainty on the part of followers. Leaders never have the luxury of using their followers as release valves. So you can be authentic about the difficulties, even about at certain moments your emotional state of being or your own uncertainty, but you only do that in a very thoughtful and deft way. Because you do it because it helps people understand you and believe in you and trust you and relate to you. But you can't, in a sense, have the luxury of saying, well, I just need to tell you about how miserable I feel right now, how uncertain I feel, or how confused I feel. Because then your leadership and the trust people have invested in you will be damaged. And that's you can't risk damaging that at a difficult time. So you have to be thoughtful about it. She's been both. She's been very good at managing the emotional piece of a crisis for her followers and herself. And she's been brilliant at keeping abreast of the latest science and the politics of trying to apply that science, because you can't apply it as stringently in most places as you'd like to. I think she gets a high marks. I thought Angela Merkel did a very, very good job of managing a complicated political scene internally and in Europe, and partly because she's a scientist, understanding what we must do to manage COVID. Angela Merkel, the head of Germany. And let me mention a couple of other people quickly in the United States. Jay Inslee, who's not in the news at all. He's the governor of Washington State. He's not in the news at all, partly because he doesn't have anything. He does his job and he does it very, very well. But he has, to me, in terms of governors, he and Gretchen Whitmer, who's had, shall we say, a difficult time in Michigan for all kinds of reasons, including threats on her life. You'll remember, or our viewers will remember, people were indicted for trying to kidnap her. But both of those governors, it seems to me, have managed the complicated politics of mitigating the crisis very, very well. So all of those people, I think, have been authentic, true to mission, good communicators, and very, very good at managing, right, the life and death reverberations of this virus.
Yeah. I love that you brought politics up because I was going to bring it up anyway. You can't disentangle the pandemic from the politics these days. I mean, we're in a very charged political climate in the US in particular, but we're seeing populism, surfacing all around the globe. For people who are feeling, not just battered by the pandemic, but battered by the political situation, I would love if you would talk a little bit about Abraham Lincoln. I know you've written about him and studied him and how he was able to lead in arguably the most divisive time in our country's history.
Sure. So one of the most important things we can learn from Lincoln's leadership, which grew and grew and grew, he was so much better in 1863 than he was in 1861, so much better in 1865 than in 1863, just kept kind of, if you will, honing those muscles of courage and resilience and steadfastness. I think a couple of things we can learn from Lincoln. First, never forgot the mission, right? And the mission changed. The mission started off save the Union with slavery where it existed. And after 1863, beginning of 1863, it's save the Union and reinvigorate the promise that all men are created equal and abolish slavery forever. So he never, ever laid down, if you will, the megaphone or got off the soapbox of talking about why we were fighting this incredibly bloody war. That's the first thing. So the mission was right there all the time. Secondly, Lincoln understood, and this is important for leaders to come back to. It was in the toolbox when you were leading so many of these webinars 2 years ago, but it's really important. He understood how to keep himself strong. So he did a lot of personal recovery. He didn't, eat or drink organic milk or do yoga, but he had lots of different ways, from riding horses for exercise to going to the theater to take his mind off the pounding, nature of his of the presidency, to understanding that he needed to walk and think and get away from the telegraph and the press of cabinet members and senators and make sense of things for himself. Time for reflection. So second lesson, you've got to keep yourself strong. And the longer this drags out, the more you have to, in a sense, keep making the first thing on your list every day. How do I keep myself as strong and vital as possible? That's physical, intellectual, and emotional. For some people, it's also spiritual. So that's a second lesson. A third lesson from Lincoln is there are no silver bullets. So Lincoln pretty quickly figured out, this was really helpful, that there wasn't one single thing that could be done. Right? If Lincoln were president now, he would not have only vaccines as the key instrument to win the war against COVID. He'd be talking about masking. He'd be talking about gathering. He'd be talking about keeping service businesses alive, even while traffic falls off during a surge. He understood you got to fight a war with a lot of different ways, on a lot of different fronts, and you have to fight it in a practicable way, right? He couldn't do early on what he thought he needed to do. He didn't have the generals, he didn't have the political support. So no silver bullets. That's really helpful, because then it unlocks all these other different things that in combination can move you forward. Last lesson from Lincoln. Understand that you can't afford to have really lasting, right, poisonous enemies. So Lincoln, for example, never called the Confederate States rebels. He never even used the word Confederacy, because he thought that legitimated an alternative country within America, an alternative government. And when peace began to look likely in early 65, he instructs General Grant, who was then the head general in the Union Army, leniency. Not unlike Mandela in South Africa becoming president in 1994. So we have to understand that when we have a very strife, kind of riven country, you actually have to resist that seductive allure to hate people or organizations or forces you regard as your enemies, because that then gives other people license to hate. And as civil rights leaders understood, very little good comes of lasting hate.
Yeah, those are great insights. Again, a couple more questions before we let you go. One of the groups that has probably been most beaten down by this thing are the healthcare workers, the people who are providing the services to make us better, have gotten caught up in all of the whirlwind of politics and science and other things that are going on. I'm wondering if there's some insight you can share with healthcare leaders who might be listening. Is there a way that they could, do what they're doing more effectively, win the hearts and minds of people who are so hesitant to be able to accept the advice that they're being given from the medical experts?
So it's a great question. Now I've worked with a lot of healthcare leaders, and not so much in the last 6 months, but a lot in early 2021, a lot in 2020. I don't think the onus for, in general, the onus for dealing with some of the divisive aspects of mitigating the crisis rests primarily on healthcare leaders. I mean, that with the exception of, say, the Surgeon General and people like Dr. Fauci, the intimate, right, public medical professionals that are involved in government. I think most healthcare leaders, people I work with, hospital CEOs, head docs, right, even the nurses who lead groups of medical assistants and physicians assistants, I don't think right now they have an onus here. I think the gauntlet rests on the ground of public, political, and state and local and national leaders here. I really do. And that gauntlet, right, I think it's to answer that question with that big caveat. Because healthcare workers are strained beyond measure right now. It's not their responsibility to keep everyone vaccinated or help keep everyone masked. The responsibility rests on leaders at all levels of our country to tell people what are 3 or 4, people can't remember more than 3 or 4 things they can do. And I know we've had a lot of that. Let me add a twist. And I think the most effective way to do that for willing leaders, some of whom were originally, say, against vaccines or against certain mitigations, and for different reasons, largely because they had personal experience with COVID, something close, either themselves or someone they knew, have changed their tune. There are a number of people, from the governor of Alabama to a few to other leaders like that. I think the way to do this is to start bringing people, followers, Americans, viewers of television shows or webinars or Twitter films, to bring them up and closer to stories of people who have COVID. That's the first thing. Second thing is to talk about something that no one's really talking about outside the epidemiological world yet, and that's long COVID, right? Which is not talked about, but an absolutely critical aspect. So you think it's mild, it's okay to get it because you think it'll give you immunity? Wait a minute, do you really want your children to develop brain fog, neurological difficulties, diabetes, early Alzheimer's? I mean, long COVID is the single biggest reason that can really cut across political divides to really think about what we can do, 1, 2, or 3, 4 things, to try and stop community spread and to try and protect ourselves and our loved ones. Last point, we're going to need leaders that can call to other times in history. We've had almost none of this since at the national or even the local level, that can call to other times in American history. I'm not talking about the Spanish flu. I'm talking about Rosie the Riveter and mobilization during the Second World War in early 42. I'm talking about the Civil War. I'm talking about the way that people on the frontier banded together. I'm talking about benevolent societies of workers, policemen helping other policemen that fall ill. Americans need to be reminded. I'm talking about Hurricane Katrina. Mm-hmm. We need to be reminded that we know how to jump into helping others, and that really empowers us as well as really offers grace and service to others. We need to be reminded of that every single day by a leader. Why every single day? Because there's so much toxicity and there's so much division coming at us through different media channels and in our politics. We have to literally appeal day by day, story by story, to the better angels of our nature. And for the life of me, I can't understand why leaders aren't doing this.
And I assume when you say leaders, you mean business leaders too. I mean, it's
you bet.
Yeah.
Because let me say one other thing about business leaders, and this is important. I wouldn't have said this 2 years ago. To everyone in the audience who's leading a business organization, your leadership has more magnetism and more power, and you have more trust from your people than you ever had before. Why? Because one of the things that COVID has shown us at a national political level, across borders, across political parties, across countries, is incompetence. surprising levels of incompetence. Now, it's been an uncertain pandemic and an unprecedented event and all that, but even allowing for those handicaps, I don't think there are many people around the world that would say, yeah, it's really been amazing to see how competent most leaders have been. So what that means if you're a business leader is you're looking for leaders that you can believe in who get the job done. So ironically, all of the way that this pandemic has been managed across countries has actually given business leaders, if you will, kind of ruby slippers in terms of how people regard their power and the trust they have in them. So you can use it now with new effectiveness.
Yeah, that's a great segue into my final question for you.
Okay.
We have a lot of young people that follow us and are probably going to be watching this video. They may not be leaders yet, but they may be aspiring to be leaders.
Yeah.
You gave some examples earlier of leaders who are rising to the occasion. We know we've seen a lot of leaders that have fallen short. What can they learn both from the good examples and the bad examples that can help them to be effective leaders when they have that opportunity?
I think first, let me start with the good leaders, and maybe this is true even of bad leaders, but they just don't do it the right way. Which is that in the midst of every storm, there's some pocket of light and possibility, and it's left to individuals, young aspiring leaders, to in a sense seek that out. Right? Don't wait for it. You have to find it in the clouds, in the high winds. You have to find it, seek it out in your organization. Roll up your sleeves, as Howard Schultz says in Starbucks, and get them in the mud, right? In that little lagoon with the light shining through while the storms rage around you. Go and roll up your sleeves and learn by doing. So that's the first. Seek out the opportunity and then be willing to work very, very hard. You're going to learn more in these kind of moments, in those kind of lagoons, than you are going to learn in the next 10 years of your life in formal schooling or formal kind of development opportunities. That's the first thing. Seek it out. Secondly, right, realize that a lot of the uncharted, the flip side of the uncharted road is the chance to build something better in all that openness. Right? Build something better. The campaign for justice and equality, what I see is the second chapter, the next chapter of the civil rights movement, which really be re-energized after Mr. Floyd's murder in 2020.
Yeah.
That's a perfect example of this, right? Let's get to work. Let's really get to work. And let's not just get to work on specific aspects of systemic racism. Let's get to work on helping more privileged Americans, that's often white Americans, understand what the experience of being a person of color is, right? So understand that there's a chance, even in all the uncertainty, and go back to the top of the conversation, even in all the stretching out, to build something lasting. Third, join with other people. COVID has been, in some ways, one of the most isolating things that has happened in the last 50 years. On the other hand, right, because of the positive possibilities of virtual connection, right? We have the opportunity to meet and talk and work with people all over the world that are, linked by something very positive, from whether it's if you will, dealing with the climate crisis, Greta Thunberg. Just take one example of an amazing young leader. She's under 20, my friends.
I know it.
Or try and provide water and sanitation in underdeveloped areas, or deal with food deserts. There's so many ways in which this crisis has lifted the shades up on issues that we want to address and that can be addressed, that aren't completely intractable. So get involved and find others that want to get involved, because that will help you grow and it will make you empowered. And then last but not least, play it clean. Play it clean. When I say that, I mean, act responsibly, act with your own sense of, hold yourself, right, to the higher road, not in a kind of perfect, 10 out of 10 way every single day. We don't live our lives that way, but you have, like most people, strong values. Live your life in small ways, and then in larger ways, in sync with those values. I say this to young people because what I have learned from watching leaders that go dirty or go bad, it's a creeping kind of condition. It comes up on you in little tiny pieces.
Yeah.
is that if you start off saying, I really am going to basically declare all my income or on my tax return, or I'm really going to basically, as someone that gave me some more money as change than I deserve, I'm going to most of the time, all the time, hand it back. I don't mean perfect. You're not prophets, but I mean basic. I'm going to apologize. I'm going to forgive. You just build this incredible deflector shield against the dirt and corruption and buying and selling of actions by leaders that we see, and we just shake our head and say, how can that be happening? You buy yourself absolute deflection from that, and in doing it act by act, you build respect in others that then feeds your strength of character.
Absolutely, words to live by. Nancy, you're always so compelling. I love having these conversations with you, and thank you for sharing your insights on this. I hope I don't have to have you back 2 years from now. Really great seeing you. Thanks so much, Nancy.
Thank you, Brian.